like I'm doing what I love, and genuinely every waking minute is spent thinking about solving this problem, and that's at the core of it is just having a urgency that this thing needs to exist in the world.
Jake, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Being that your company is a bit of a disruptor company in the space you're in, have you always seen yourself as someone who disrupts the norm?
I think about especially what we're doing with Soot, but things that I've tried to do more broadly as uh, like thinking about it in terms of problem solving. I think there's often these very complex problems, and generally people reach for complex solutions to solve them, right? Look at, in our case, we're disrupting the interface of the computer. And when you look at the kind of like capitalistic exploitation, this thing that used to be this uh, kind of very utopian kind of in its origins, the computer was this kind of like utopian that had this wide utopian possibility space, and 20, 30 years later, as we were kind of trapped in the feed, it's easy to look at uh, uh, the kind of solution space for how to break our serotonin and our attention spans out of the feed as needing to be as complex as the problem seems, right? Does it take regulation? Does it take, do we need to actually like change things about, the incentive structure for capitalistic enterprise? Like, these are all very difficult, complex problems. And I find a lot of enjoyment in kind of trying to be patient and looking around in the shadows behind the complex problem and trying to find a simple problem, because simple problems are often much easier to solve than complex problems. And and so I think that that's the thing that motivates me. So with, in this case, it's like maybe actually the problem has to do with the geometry of the interface. And geometry problems are pretty easy to solve comparatively, which is why which kind of set off what we're working on. But other things that I was doing in the past, like before this, developing communication systems for self-driving cars, another kind of seemingly complex problem. But when you kind of break down the elements, you realize that there's some simple problems hiding in plain sight that can, if you focus on those, you can do a lot of damage. And so I think the end result might seem like kind of maybe you could call it disruptor, but really it's just finding clever ways to navigate something that feels really impossible to approach.
So it sounds like you've always had good awareness and being able to size up what's going on and then understanding it and then adapting to come up with a solution. You told me offline of your history as a piano player
Yeah,
and that you used to play piano
yeah,
for a good amount of time each day. Maybe talk about your history as a piano player
yeah.
and what that's led to and how it's been infused into what, the work you do today.
Yeah, it's a really, I find it a very like a very grateful for that experience. As I mentioned, from eighth grade until I graduated college, basically I was that like mega nerd that didn't have friends, and I just practiced piano 8 hours a day, and I would like skip school to go to the music room, and and I think that what was valuable about it is the piano is like this very constrained uh, uh, space that you can play with creative challenges, things like how to practice, right? Like how to get effective at practicing, or even, things that I was experimenting with harmony and melody and rhythm. It's kind of a model for something that can be applied at a much bigger scale. But it's something that uh, you know, I call practicing, but honestly, like half the time I was there just like experimenting with sounds and trying to get as deep as I could into the kinds of things that I wanted to say on the piano. And it's actually really nice to have this very kind of constrained environment, and a lot of freedom to try and push it as far as you can. And so, you know. Eventually got to a point where it was clear that, like, I was far from being the best pianist in New York City, let alone like, at the level of to become a professional. Um, but looking back on that time, I think what I took from it was just this approach to problem solving, kind of creative problem solving, that also I think in some ways like embracing one's own ignorance. Like a lot of the things that I've tried to do, I was like very much like unqualified for, and if I had known what I knew, after I was like a year or two into the thing that I was working on, I probably wouldn't have even tried to start. But that kind of like starting from a place of ignorance and curiosity, I think often leads to interesting solutions yeah, I think a lot of that comes out of this kind of experimental approach to composition.
And, you would classify a lot of what you did in those years as an NYU student and thereafter that was more audio oriented.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas today, there may be elements of audio, but you're more in a visual experimentation. Do you have both a strong audio and visual capturing sensibility yourself, or are you stronger in one of the two? How do you think about how those two worlds have played out for you?
Yeah, I think, even with music, like I'm not don't have like an incredibly good ear. I had to work really hard to be as good as people who weren't practicing 8 hours a day. And I don't necessarily have the best like visual sense as a designer. Um, but I think the things that they have in common is like at some point I think about this a lot with like the life cycle of an artist, right? At the beginning, you're focusing on experimenting within your medium. And then once you kind of discover your voice and understand your identity as an artist and kind of what your prime medium is, then you can move outward in these like broader concentric circles of, okay, now I can focus on the platform. And then so then you can play with things like how the work is presented in what context. And then you can go structurally outwards to then, okay, well, what is the like um, economy and the delivery system for how this work is able to be transmitted to a broader audience. And I feel like that continuum has been kind of the same. And so the fact that the things I'm working on now involve more with like creative coding and design and visual interfaces, it feels very much like the mechanics of how I approach it are kind of identical. Um, and I wasn't very good at music to begin with, so it's like not a too big of a evolution to then become like somebody who's not very good at visual
A-
either.
And you told me about the transition from school to being a sound artist,
Yeah,
and there was a project that you took on in Venice at an art exhibit, a
yeah,
famous art exhibit.
yeah. The
Maybe
Venice
touch on
Biennial.
that. I found that to be interesting, and if you don't mind, talk about the country that you did work for and how that manifested.
Yeah, so there was like I guess an open call like in 2017 for a lot of things that I've done have always been kind of like through the side door, and so yeah, there was a pavilion. It was the Antarctica Pavilion, which is like one of the adjunct events happening during the Venice Biennial, and yeah, it was a really great experience to be able to be there and to be there showing work, and so I got really interested in microsound, which is like compositions that are on the scale of like 500 milliseconds or less, and sirens, and a lot of that comes from growing up in Washington D.C. at the National Gallery of Art in DC, which was like my favorite place to be on the weekend. Um, they had a series of paintings by Barnett Newman called Stations of the Cross. And Barnett Newman is famous for these gestures that he calls zips, which are basically these rough, abstract kind of lines of paint on a canvas with different kinds of textures. And I was very inspired by that. And later, when I was experimenting with electronic music, found that I was it's kind of like a fractal, right? The more you zoom into these like really kind of tiny moments of sound, these worlds continue to unfold, and I found that there was like nothing more to say than what was contained within this very rough bursts of sound in 500 milliseconds. That also I think I was kind of able to be aware of mainly because of the influence of Barnett Newman. And so, yeah, being in Venice, I had now been showing these burst works for a few years in different museums and institutions. And with Venice was the first time that I then connected this to sirens. So I had a bunch of like military grade speaker systems that had a range of around 2 kilometers, and we put them up in this palazzo, and they were bursting sirens all over the place. And it's the kind of experience that you would walk into and think that something was wrong. And Sirens are very fascinating because they trigger a particular part of the brain. They basically bypass the auditory cortex, and they stimulate the amygdala directly. This like fight or flight response. And so I was very fascinated with this idea of like sublime compassion. That something that is like you just don't have the mechanical wiring in your thought process to take something that is actually incredibly beautiful aesthetically. I mean, sirens are like they're the most modernist aesthetic statement that you could possibly encounter, but because it is so alarming, like it's almost unavailable to be perceived in an aesthetic way. And so, just by placing the siren with the kind of like police military equipment in an exhibition space, it kind of forces the audience to bridge that gap. And so, but yeah, it was not very popular with like museum staff and gallery staff, and they would be like, "Oh, like once I would do the install, and then the piece would be running, to be like." Are you serious? I have to show up to work with this playing, and I, since retired from
Right.
doing that, and I should
Well,
write an
speaking of,
apology letter.
as a New Yorker and as a fellow New Yorker
Yeah,
now, obviously sirens when you're on your phone on the street,
yeah,
even with headphones in, with noise canceling, still irritate people.
yeah. And now they
What
got the thumpers, the bass, so
yeah.
you can't really
What's
get,
the
you can't,
future of the siren? If it was up to Jake,
yeah.
how would you implement the future siren, let's say in 10, 15, 20 years in New York? What's the direction sirens could be going?
So we actually have it's already now out. For a few years, I was working on developing like the voice of self-driving cars, basically how they communicate to pedestrians for a company called Zoox. It's now the Amazon self-driving car, and invented a lot of really amazing technology. It's the most speakers on the exterior of any production vehicle in history. So there's 48. Is it 48? Maybe it's 64. I can't. 64 speakers, 32 on the front and 32 on the back, in an array. And what it does is it transmits sound. It has two modes, beamforming mode and spatial mode. And what's really clever about it is that, when you combine computer vision from the vehicle that understands the position of a pedestrian and the likelihood of that pedestrian intersecting with the vehicle, so you have this model, and then you can also now direct beams of sound at that pedestrian with a full library of different kinds of communications. It creates a much more nuanced, safer, more kind of also more like
Dynamic sounds,
dynamic
right?
way of communicating that means that like now you have this palette, this range of ways for the vehicle to communicate, because the horn is only one option. We've been stuck with the horn. It's this mechanical device that's been around since like horse-drawn carriages. It's like one of the last remnants of the Industrial Revolution when it comes to like we even call it a horn. And so I think that the future sound of cities, it's interesting when you connect it to an idea like stench, right? The primary experience of living in a city used to be the overwhelming smell of putrefaction and decay. People would dump, cadavers in the streets, and there was no sewage system. Louis, and then there was the Louis Pasteur moment, where suddenly bacteria and stench became associated with disease. And in a very short amount of time, cities all around the world cleaned up, and it went from smelling like they did to the kind of experiences of cities today, which, obviously they have their smells, but it's nothing like what it used to be. But we never really had the Louis Pasteur moment with sound. We're still surrounded by noise and the effects of noise on what it means to live in a city. And so um, that's going to shift. Some aspect of that is actually the noisier part of cars now is really the tire noise, and there's not much you can do about that. And somebody has to invent some kind of new polymer that's quiet. I can't imagine what that would be, but vehicle communication is about to get a lot safer, a lot quieter, more nuanced. It turns out that like what you need to get somebody's attention to see the vehicle in different scenarios can be different things. And so yeah, I think that's maybe more of a detailed answer
Yeah.
than you're looking
No,
for. But
it's good. It's a good conversation. It's an expertise that not everyone shares like you were able to. So you were at Zooks
yeah,
and you were working obviously within a big organization, right?
yeah,
A developed startup in some ways.
yeah. I mean,
Established company,
it's
but
like it's a car company,
right.
but it was 300 people, right? Like 300 people in a car company is nothing. So it felt very, very, very small. And I think I was very lucky because if I were to try to do the same thing at like Toyota or even at Tesla, these massive organizations, I would have had nowhere near the kind of like base metal learning of not only needing to have the idea, but also build all the prototypes and test it. And I spent 3 years riding around in cars shooting sounds of pedestrians in San Francisco with a GoPro and just learning. And so yeah, I think it being really small taught me a lot about how to work with AI and advanced hardware engineering and all of these things that as a pianist you don't really get to interact with necessarily.
What was the inspiration for Soot?
So I was talking about self-driving cars, and I promise this is a story about Soot in a second, but one of the biggest challenges with like developing this sound system that can communicate to pedestrians on public roads is that it's very noisy and it's unpredictably noisy, right? So um, that's one of the reasons why horns are the way they are, is because it's kind of guaranteed to be audible. Um, but so we were doing a lot of work to try and figure out, different techniques, maybe even using like machine learning to build models to understand, like, could we predict how noisy the environment would be from the point of view of the pedestrian we wanted to communicate to like tune the audio that's being transmitted to them. But that's really expensive and complicated. And so to try and find maybe other sources of inspiration or like, yeah, design inspiration, I did a lot of research into really kind of like complex or dense communication environments to kind of see what strategies were being used. And of course, by far the most competitive communication environment in the world is a rainforest. And so that sent me down this really long rabbit hole. And as you can imagine, I was using Google to do a lot of this research. But I was really fascinated to discover that, like, in a rainforest, you can hear thousands of pieces of information simultaneously. And it's not the case that it's this cacophony of noise like a city is. In fact, it's more like an orchestra. It's extremely well organized. You can hear insects, primates, apex predators. Everyone's communicating in distinct acoustic niches that allow all that information to be audible at once. And and how these kind of like natural complex ecosystems become so efficient when you think of it as an interface is because all information in nature is self-organizing, right? So because these different species naturally kind of bifurcate into their own distinct acoustic channels, it means that every bit of information is really accessible. You can hear everything together and make sense of it all together. So I was looking at Google, finding like recordings of rainforests, and I kept noticing something that I hadn't seen before, which is, in Google in the top left corner, they have this, it's almost like a false promise, right? Like you search for rainforest and it says 30 million search results. But when you look at the screen, you don't see 30 million things. You see 5 links, 2 ads. Like the bandwidth of information that you can access in a single frame is like unbelievably small. Um, if you wanted to traverse the 30 million things and kind of discover how they all interrelate, you actually physically couldn't, right? It's impossible.
Right?
So that's
It
what I
would
mean by
take more than 8 hours, like you played the piano for, to scroll through it, right?
no, it wouldn't make any sense.
Right.
And so I was like, wait, how is it that in these natural ecosystems that have self-organization, you can access thousands of things in a single frame in the best digital interface in the world, right? The most efficient interface for exploring information that we have, you get 5 or 6. Like, surely we can do better than 5 or 6. And so that kind of set off this now 5-year journey of trying to re-architect the interface for how we navigate and share digital information to utilize this kind of pattern of self-organization. And and so I spent about a year learning basic machine learning and kind of training myself how to code and copy and paste. Like, this is before, now you could do this easily. You just kind of use AI to help you code. But back then you really had to like copy and paste open source libraries together and got a functioning prototype. Took a year. And the first thing that I mapped actually was a website it was like a bunch of like shopping, it was a shopping site. And that was like the major moment of seeing this shopping site that's all grid and you have to scroll through to find everything. You don't know how anything connects. Seeing in a single view, like 1,000 images in a single view. And it took 30 minutes to run the program, and it was static. I couldn't do anything with it. It just like printed out an image. But seeing that was like, okay, this is definitely the future. If I can find a way to make this fast and intuitive, and easy to use, then like, any sufficiently advanced sci-fi movie, all the interfaces look like that, right? Like Minority Report, or even like, Tony Stark's computer. Like, um, it seemed like obvious that this is the future. And so the question was like, could we even build it? And that was what took the most time. Was, you know, every step along the way, we'd find these new kind of deep wells of technical challenges that we had to solve one by one. I mean, starting with computer graphics, it's like very fundamental thing, but there was no capability to get 5,000 high-res images and videos to load on a screen and have them still be interactive and fluid, and have it load, fast enough to feel like a good experience, right? It would take like, 10, 20 minutes. Um, so like reinventing graphic streaming on the browser, reinventing AI data visualization, like all these little pieces, and then finally also like the user experience, right? Because it's a totally new way of interacting with information. So how do you make that feel simple, like drag and drop? You don't want it to feel like a PhD, like a MIT Media Labs PhD project. It needs to feel obvious. And so yeah, set off on that journey, raised first round of capital in December of 2020, and then left Zooks to then pursue this full time, and I've been working on this ever since.
And if you were kind of distilling down what Soot is, just in a sentence or two, how do you explain to people what the company does and what the technology is built for?
Yeah, so in a sense, Soot is a tool for mapping information visually. Um, the first 50 years or the first 40 years of the computer were about grids, right? The like main user experience that we have is like all information will be sorted in a hierarchical linear grid. Soot is a map. A map is spatial. A map is self-organizing. A map reveals relationships between things. And so we think that the next 50 years of the interface will be based on the map as the kind of core kind of interface for not just navigating files or exploring websites, but also how you create. And it kind of has a very, when you start to like connect outward to all the different things that we use computers for, it has a lot of impacts on things that are kind of surprising. For example, going back to this kind of term, the file system is really the model in which all experiences that we use a computer for are based. If you're reading the New York Times, you're scrolling through social media, these are all different manifestations of a file system. And they're based on that same linear hierarchy or linear architecture, right? The feed is like the file system in boss mode, right? That's like, let's take this linear architecture and just like wring every ounce of value that we possibly can and capture the user's attention as much as we can. But the feed is essentially, yeah, it's like the file system on steroids. Um, so when you change that interface to be something that is not a feed, but more like a cloud, a self-organizing cloud where information doesn't vanish into the feed. Instead, it accumulates into this pool that you can kind of fly through and access, and is continually organizing itself. So it's always intuitive and easy to fly through. It impacts like, how news will be served. It impacts e-commerce experiences. It impacts, imagine dating apps in that experience. Like instead of swiping right, swiping left, you see all the cuties in New York City in one view, and you just draw a circle around the area that you like, and it's like, single use dating app, and then you get to chatting. So we're working on building that base functionality of the file system layer, and then in the next, which we just launched actually about 100 days ago, and then from here it's connecting that to all the different manifestations that the file system exists in the world.
And when you say you launched 100 days ago and the company has been around for the last 4 or 5 years,
Yeah.
getting to that, talk to me about what it was like getting to that moment where you formally rolled it out to
Yeah.
potential users.
I'm not the first person to say this. It's definitely true though. Like it's kind of like eating glass and trying to convince yourself that you enjoy how it tastes. um, it's yeah, I mean, but also like just it's so much fun. It's just pure invention.
Where
And
were you when you launched? Were you in the office? Were you at home? Somewhere else?
yeah, it was here. Now, when I say launch, like, so I started to invite users onto the platform. It's still private, so you still apply, and then we let you in. But um, yeah, the results have been, honestly, I think that's the most rewarding thing for me. Marcel Duchamp calls this the artist coefficient, right? There's a thing that the artist intends to express, there's a thing that the artist actually expresses, and then there's what the audience perceives, and they're all different. And so that's the artist coefficient, that arc. And so obviously there's like what I want this to be, but nothing's more rewarding than like seeing on Instagram somebody that you don't know post their Soot space because they just mapped their,
Right. Give us an example of like some of the creative use cases of Soot in the early days.
The most interesting, most hilarious was a brand. They're in the building actually called Stuff, Barcelona based, but Jeppy, the designers, has an office here, and they wanted to do this like discount code game called Find the Imposter. So they made a space of 5,000 pictures of cats, but there's like three pictures of dogs dressed up as cats. And if you can find the the imposter within the thing, there's a link to a discount code, and you click the link, and it takes you through to the site. And we were just like, that's the stuff we love to see.
Right.
It's so creative. Also, people are building like pretty big shopping platforms with this. Like,
So how would walk me through how a shopping platform, middle of the road use case
yeah.
would leverage Soot?
Well, we did a project with Essence like when we were still in R&D mode, but that's now since evolved in a way that I think is really interesting. We all have that friend who's like got the best taste and knows about all the cool stuff, right? And now they can literally just copy and paste a link from their favorite designers into Soot, and it just maps everything. So, in a few minutes, you can create this space of 5,000 images, 5,000 items from your favorite designers. Um, and because it links back to the source, it actually functions fully like an e-commerce site. We have people that are, people have made them, that have released them, and because we see the metrics that are coming in, like people are actually, buying stuff through this, and this is now a source that people go to be like, oh yeah, that really cool creative collection that somebody with good taste made that has the same volume of products as an Essence or any, one of these, like
Yeah.
a name of another, but which I think is amazing, right? Because for one, there's no one in the middle, so they can just go and buy directly from the designer, but they're still able to have that experience of seeing, a rich collection of
Right.
things.
It's almost like a digital rack in that explanation,
Yeah,
right? Where
yeah,
you see everything laid out,
yeah.
similar if you come to a room to see all the products in real life, right?
Literally, it's the thing that catch the corner of your eye and your ambient in the peripheral vision that where you're like that thing. You can't have that experience on e-commerce sites today.
Yeah. And we were talking about AI, right? You're an
Yeah,
AI company,
yeah.
but based on the technology and the way the system works, you want to just touch on your use of AI. Has that evolved over the last few years? Is it something that day one you were an AI company and you've just it's progressed in the way you've used tools and technology available, or
Yeah.
have you infused AI into it midstream based on what you saw coming down the pipe?
Yeah, it's funny because we're, I guess, like most commonly referred to as an AI company, but AI is like the one thing that we didn't build in the sense that, um, we built everything else around the AI that allows the platform to function, but we also like, being in the game of creating our own models is like, there's nation state level funding that's going towards that activity, and massive open source communities that are finding and creating like really incredible models. And what we wanted to provide was the platform where you could just plug in the latest and greatest model for whatever you want to do, and then you have all of the kind of visualization tools and the design and interface layer around that, so that you can access it with whatever you want to put into it. So the vast majority of our time is spent thinking about everything but the AI, even though AI is the critical kind of thing at the core.
Got it. And ultimately, now that you're on the startup, living the startup founder life, and everyone out there that's running a company today or thinking about starting their own is always intrigued by telling their own story, but also hearing from others how life is for other startup founders. How would you kind of characterize the intensity and the demands that correspond with founding and running a company like Soot?
Yeah, I mean, there's no there's so many different ways of doing it, and, I only know one way, and I'd be kind of doing the same thing whether it was my own company or not, because that's just how I am. Like, I don't have hobbies, I don't, like, do pottery like, I'm doing what I love, and, genuinely every waking minute is spent thinking about, solving this problem, and, um, so, yeah, I think, like, that's at the core of it just having a urgency that this thing needs to exist in the world and doing everything it takes to do it. I find myself often doing things that I never would have thought would occupy my time, like, early companies will like HR stuff or, um, sometimes you're like, having to look at like, you know,
Accounting's always a
accounting,
fun one,
all
right?
this kind of stuff that, is essential for the broader vision. I think the other thing that I was talking about this with a founder friend recently, but to do a startup, sometimes you have to be both the most patient and most impatient person in the world at the same time, because it's never going to move as fast as you want it to, um, especially if what you're trying to do is hard or there's not things off the shelf that you can just like plug together. Some people build companies like that, which I really am envious of. Some people, it's like 3 months and then they're at the market. I'm like, wow, I wish I had that kind of like way of moving. But uh, so you have to be incredibly patient because things take time. Sometimes years. But you also have to be insanely impatient because at every minute it's like just being the making sure that there's a strong force of gravity that is, like, pulling all of the things that need to happen that allow the project to continue running. So, yeah, I think it's, like, that's kinda what it feels like is living in those two mindsets at the same time.
And everyone's always thinking investors are thinking about this, the team is, like, making sure the leader of the company is in a good headspace. How do you balance the rigors of what you're doing with finding your moments of downtime to really reset? Are you going back to your roots and playing the piano? Are you going to museums? Are you traveling? What do you do to offset some of the pressure and intensity of what you're building?
Well, I think it's the thing that I try to offset is not so much, like, the intensity or pressure, because I actually, like, that doesn't r I enjoy kind of that texture being kind of ever present, but I think that something that I found really valuable is 1 day a week, I kind of take a research day. So what I mean by research day is like I'll spend the day doing anything that has nothing to do with soot, um, but is like a research interest, and it is something like inevitably leads to breakthroughs that then influence what I'm doing the next week. So it's like, uh, uh, you could call it like random initialization, or like there's other ways of kind of talking about it in a systemic level where it's like my brain is kind of in this local area of thinking, and then by injecting a little bit of noise from somewhere else, it kind of unblocks the ability to maneuver in that space. And so for a long time it was going to museums, just depending on what I'm thinking about. When I was trying to work on what the interface should look like and the design language, because there's a lot of things that we had to navigate, because there's not really a lot of patterns or UX patterns that we can pull from for what it feels like to navigate 5,000 objects in a single view, right? And so I took a lot of inspiration from particularly like the painting of Joan Miro, a lot of kind of like pre-industrial revolution, like illuminated manuscripts. Um, so I was going to museums that had like illuminated manuscript archives, and just kind of soaking in all these different kind of examples of form and shapes and things, and yeah, I would love if the future of computers looked like a Joan Miro painting, with these like organic, curved, bright colored shapes that all feel very tactile and alien.
So if you were designing the future computer, knowing what you know and being so passionate about the visualization of it all,
Yeah.
what's your vision for what the computer will look like, function like in the next decade?
Yeah, I think the next decade will be like this, but then the decade following, I don't see really there being much. Uh, I think it's very likely the kind of like cyborg future is, given enough time, will be how we roll. Like the idea of a device being the intermediary between bits and your brain is like the, a screen being the intermediary between bits and your brain is like unlikely to be like a, a long-term thing. But in the next 10 years, I think getting away from wearable VR is where I would like to see it go. And something that we've been working on, it's kind of like a deep background, long-term hardware project. What is the form factor of that? But there's a few benefits from when AR VR peripheral is not wearable. Um, and also, I think like being in the position we are, we don't have like $1 billion in funding to put toward like Apple did with the Vision Pro, and so you get some benefits with like prototyping when it doesn't have to be born on your head because uh, it's really expensive to make electronics that are that small and light with batteries and all these things that to make a wearable. But yeah, I think that's likely where we'll get into. And yeah, I think the main thing though is I think it's very clear that spatial self-organizing interfaces are basically the only way that we're going to be able to make sense of this constant deluge of information as we continue to expand.
And then where do you see your company in the next 5 years? Where do you see it going, or how do you see it functioning? What's the direction of Soot?
Yeah, so I'd like if we're able to continue, I see society as a whole breaking up with the grid. And, you know, talking about it in more kind of grounded terms, um, anyone should be able to navigate their entire digital life, whether it's, shopping online, ordering food, or like all the creative work that they're doing in this kind of like unified environment, right? Where everything is able to live together. Um, and, um, and kind of flipping we kind of live right now in a model where the tools and applications that you use computers to access are kind of like walled gardens, right? You have to like carry your data around from one walled garden to another, right? To just complete an idea. You might use a spreadsheet to do analysis, and then you have to like copy and paste those numbers into like a document where you can show it as a presentation, right? For example. But I think that's about to flip, particularly with generative AI, obviously with Soot Spaces contributing. I think it's going to become much more like a data-centric view where, for example, imagine you're on an e-commerce site and you drag a circle around things that you like, and then you bring them into your world, like into your Soot Space or other. And now these images can live in a much more ambiguous state. Are they images that you're shopping with? Are they inspiration for a mood board? They should be able to be in this kind of like hyper potential state, where they can be both at the same time. Um, and I think that is one of the really appealing things about AI is that it allows the complexity of information to live in this kind of state of superposition where it can be many things at once, and it doesn't have to be locked into a particular context.
I think this was a great conversation. We're going to turn over to what we call our rapid fire rocket round.
Yeah.
So we have, 5 to 10 questions. Shorter answers are preferred, but if you want to let something
Yeah.
rip, you can.
Okay.
All right. So, first question. What's a book, movie, or podcast that has profoundly shaped your perspective on life and work?
I would say this book called Scale by Jeffrey West, which is a book about complexity sciences. And complexity sciences is this like unifying discipline that aligns anthropology, sociology, economics, and kind of shows that really like scale and the emergence that comes from complex networks at scale um, is the engine that drives everything that we experience in life.
If you could sit down for dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
I think it would be it's a good question. Uh, I'd have to say Duke Ellington.
What are you asking Duke Ellington in that sit down?
I'm just there to listen. I'm just
Okay.
there to absorb, the stories and, yeah, Duke Ellington is like a sage of creative thinking.
Respect. What's one habit or routine you swear by for maintaining focus and clarity?
So, we talked about the research day.
Yes.
That's the main one. Um, and what else? I think that's otherwise, I think another habit that I really enjoy is, like, from 10 p.m. till around 5 a.m. is, like, my solo exploration time, That's when I'm kinda back at the piano, so to speak,
That's
working on
only
stuff.
7 hours, though.
That's
You need
true,
that
yeah.
eighth hour. When
Well,
do you sleep? When do you sleep? 5 to 9?
yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah. How many hours a night are you sleeping?
Not enough, maybe,
Okay, let's get that up. You
yeah,
gotta
yeah.
you gotta get the wearables. Best advice you've ever received from a mentor?
Avoid complexity.
What's a decision you've made as a founder that you're most proud of?
There's certain, like, key hires that, had a very kind of, cheeky story behind how we were able to, convince certain people to leave their very lucrative software jobs to come work at a startup, but, yeah.
Talent acquisition, right? Is key. If you could start over and pursue a completely different career from anything you've done, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think it would be fun to solve measurement.
Elaborate.
So, everything from anywhere there's a complex social phenomena that we measure with a single value metric, standardized testing in schools, credit ratings, like the outcomes of medical studies. Uh, Anytime we use a single value metric to measure complex phenomena, it's incredibly often the metric contorts reality and kind of fucks up the thing that it's trying to measure. And I think that also, with machine learning, clustering algorithms, there's a potential to do it in a much better way. And so I think that would be a really fun problem to solve.
I'm confident saying you'll be the only one that answers that question with the answer measurement. So that was a good one. All right. In one sentence, how would you define success? And that could be success at Soot, success in life.
Yeah. So I think of there's this sutra called the Vairocana, and in it, it's Buddhist sutra, and in it there's this huge section around Buddhist objects. Like you have the mind of a well; it's infinitely deep, but it reflects light back to the surface. Things like that. Mind of a cave, etc. Um, I think of success. So I think of myself as being a leaky cup. Somehow, by some means, like resources are flowing in one end, but there's a bunch of holes in the bottom, and it's just leaking out all around me. And that's kind of the like thing that motivates me is to be this leaky cup. And so for me, success would be to be in a position where the flow of water through that cup was self-sustaining.
All right, so that's going to put a wrap on the episode. Appreciate you participating. Look forward to continuing our friendship and seeing, your success and the passioning of your cup in the future. So thanks for doing this, Jake.
Always love having a chat with you. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, buddy.